So this here is the third card that we're going to make. So similar-ish to the last one is in its water, but what we're going to do is we're going to use some embossing glazes for coloring the water. Now embossing glazes are embossing powder, but they're not opaque, they're transparent, and I thought it was appropriate for this, for the water, to use the embossing glazes to give it a nice transparent look. And I like how they combine when you layer them together. Now this is just on white cardstock, and I'm going to address something just before. It might be a question you're thinking while I'm demonstrating this. Now the white is just cardstock, and while I was doing this I was thinking, wouldn't that be cool to have white underneath it so that that white would have some dimension to it? I tried it and it didn't work. It was just too rough. The stamping and embossing over top, the ink wouldn't get a clear coverage over the top of the embossing no matter how hard I tried. It worked very well for this, but only on the cardstock. So yeah, I tried it. I thought it would look really, really cool, and it did not turn out the way I had hoped. So we're going to take our piece of cardstock and put it into the stamp positioner here. Now, same as with the last one, I'm going to leave this out just a little bit to account for a little bit of a ridge on the edge of these stamps. Just because I want to make sure that the stamping is all on the cardstock. I don't want to have a little white edge there. I mean, if you did end up having a white edge there, you could trim it down, but much easier to eliminate that in the first place than to need to trim it down. So I'm just going to position my things a little bit closer. So I'm using a clear ink. I'm using Versamark, which is a clear embossing ink, and I'm going to stamp it 2 times right away to get a clear impression. Now with the embossing ink, it does end up being shiny, so you can see where it is on the cardstock. And I need to get my things out of the way here. And I like to stamp them a couple times just to make sure that I have good coverage. But like I said, you can see where it stamps. I also like to press it down to make sure that it is making good contact. It's pretty good, but I'm going to do it one more time. This layer with it on the cardstock, you can definitely see where it stamps. Once we go for the next layer and we're stamping on top of embossing, you're not going to be able to see where it is stamping. So that adds a little bit of extra challenge, but that's okay. So I'm going to take my lighter of the 2 colors. And there we go. Put the excess back in the container. I always put the excess back in the container and close it because I tend to be a little bit klutzy in the fact that if something is there to tip over, I probably will. Now, some of those white spots are supposed to be there, some of those are not. So you can tell by the image on the top, they're not supposed to be white spots in there. So this is how we're going to fix it. I have an embossing pen. There we go. So this is an embossing pen. And all I'm going to do, it's the same ink that's in the embossing pad. I'm just going to color where it's supposed to be filled in. And then the powder should stick to that. and then we can melt it again. So sometimes things just don't work out perfectly even though they're supposed to, and it's great to know ways to fix it if that happens. All right, so it does make a little bit of a darker area on there. I'm okay with that. Water is never completely one color anyways. So what I'm going to do is I'm just putting some on the rest of this just to blend that in a little bit more. Some of it is going to be hidden by the next layer anyways, but much easier to do that now than to try to do that later. And I do leave my heat gun on it just a few extra seconds just to try to get that embossing as smooth as possible. And I'm not cleaning my stamps right now. I will clean them all at the end once I'm done creating my card. Now for the next layer. It's always fun, especially with these color layering ones, just to find different ways to get extra texture, a different texture in them. So I love using this embossing glaze with it. Now when you're embossing, often the cardstock will warp a little bit, and it's happened here. You can see this is lifting up, but that's okay. We're going to position this anyways. And then we will ink it and stamp it. Now because we're stamping a shiny ink onto a shiny surface, meaning the embossing powder, we're not going to actually be able to, or the embossing, the finished embossing, we're not actually going to be able to see where it stamps. So I'm just going to stamp it several times just to give it the best chance at giving as much coverage as possible. Now because we're doing this on water, and water is never even, and this stamp isn't even or whatever, if I miss a spot, I'm not too worried about it. I think it's still going to end up looking fairly natural, fairly a good likeness to water anyways. So let's see what we got here. There we go. And we're going to melt that. If you wanted to have a little bit more of that dark in there. And some of these places are not parts that would be dark on the stamp, but that's okay. If you wanted to add extra, you can absolutely add some extra. And that's where those embossing pens come in really handy. They're great for fixing up areas or adding extra embossing. And you can also use them, say, to sign your name or whatever and emboss it, or write a handwritten message and then emboss it. There we go. I'm going to put this to the side and I'll clean that up later.